bitter breeze of the Viking winter blew through the icy mountains, while the sounds of war drums echoed in the distance. Most of the seasoned warriors had departed, following uncertain paths in search of riches and alliances, leaving behind only a handful of young and inexperienced men to guard the village's borders. It was a simple task, a routine mission, a seemingly harmless job. But little did they know that fate had other plans, and at the moment the shadows of night fell over the land, the winds would bring something much darker than any storm. On a cold and gloomy morning, the group of young men found themselves faced with discovery that would change the course of their lives. They had found an enemy camp full of barbarians, preparing a massive attack that threatened to destroy everything they knew. They were not ready to face a battle like that, nor were they equipped to fight such large forces. The choice was clear: survive or lose everything. But there was one problem. Time was against them. With each passing second, the enemy army approached closer, and the village's chances of survival diminished drastically. The only option was to act stealthily, using intelligence and the spirit of survival. But how to attack when the enemy was many and resources were scarce? The group knew they needed to set fire to the enemy's supplies, gather crucial information, and return to the village before the enemy was at their gate. Each step was a race against time, a battle against cold, hunger, fear, and even despair. However, as the group advanced, something extraordinary happened. Those who had previously not gotten along were forced to unite, to help each other, to become more than mere warriors. They became a true brotherhood, and it was from this union that the greatest victories arose. The icy wind cut across the vast lands of the Norse as Harold's troops advanced, a sea of shields and steel reflecting the dying light of the day. Under the overcast sky, where the clouds seemed to drag heavily like omens of death, marched the fearsome army of Harold the Conqueror. His ranks of warriors, ruthless and unforgiving, stretched as far as the eye could see, yet another force of destruction on a continent already scarred by war. Each soldier was more than a sharp blade or a strong arm. They were an extension of the brutality of their leader, a man whose reputation preceded his steps and whose name inspired both fear and respect. Harold the Conqueror was not just a king or a leader. He was a living legend, forged in the fires of battle and tempered in the lapse of desolation. Born in the frozen wastelands of a Norway ravaged by warring clans, Harold learned early on that to survive, he had to conquer and subjugate. His father, the great King Sigurd, had passed on him a legacy of warriorship, but it was Harold himself who would get a family name and notoriety that would spread to every corner of the Viking world and beyond. Harold's first great conquest came when he was still a young man, under the shadow of his father. The city of Tunsberg, rich and prosperous, was the first to fall to the power of the Viking prince. Through a combination of cunning and brute force, Harold achieved his first great military feat. He laid siege to the city and, in a bloody siege that lasted for weeks, eliminated any attempt at resistance. Accounts tell of ruthless executions, of entire villages being burned, and of men who, at the end of the battle, would rather face death than be taken prisoner. But Harold did not merely destroy Tunsberg. He made it a symbol, erecting an impregnable fortress on its ruins and marking the territory as part of his empire. In the years that followed, his campaigns extended throughout Norway, and soon Harold would conquer lands beyond the seas, imposing his rule even on the frigid and treacherous islands of Shetland and Orkney. His enemies, once renowned for their strength, fell mercilessly before the blade of his warriors. One after another, the clans of northern Scotland fell to the conqueror's sword, and Harold became known throughout northern Europe as a man who could level entire empires with a speed and precision that frightened even the most seasoned strategists. The brutality of Harold's campaigns was not limited to the lands he conquered. He traveled from village to village, uniting peoples through force and threat. No local leader dared question him, for they knew that if they did, their land would be reduced to ashes. When Harold arrived in the city, he brought with him a banner of blood, not only the symbol of his empire, but also the promise of devastation for any who dared resist. And resistance, they knew, meant death. It was in his campaign south, on the island of Great Britain, that Harold made his mark. After defeating the Celtic kingdoms with an iron fist, he led his fleet down to the English coast. The Anglo-Saxons, who until then had been known for their military skill and ironclad resilience, were not ready for the Vikings' fury. Under the ruthless leadership of Harold the Conqueror, England saw its walls crumble before the might of the Norse Empire. Using formidable siege tactics, Harold stormed cities such as York, destroyed entire villages, and sank enemy fleets in the icy waters of the North Sea. He forced the surrender of one of the greatest kingdoms on the island. And in his triumph, he had a gigantic fortress built on the ruins of York as an immortal reminder of the power of his name. And it was in this setting of violence and power that Harold the Conqueror's army gained notoriety. It was not just a military force, but a war machine, an impersonal entity driven by revenge, plunder, and conquest. Its warriors were forged in iron and blood, schooled in the arts of war from childhood, trained to kill and subdue without hesitation. With each victory, the army grew, its ranks expanded, and more territories fell under its rule. It became the nightmare of the southern kingdoms and the legend of the men of the north. The real terror, however, lay not in Harold's strength alone. It lay in his strategic skill. He knew that war was not won by brute force alone, but by the cold, calculating intelligence of a strategist. Harold conquered territory not by strength of arm alone, but by his sharp mind. When his forces were at a disadvantage, he would retreat, outwit the enemy, deplete their resources, and then, when they least expected it, strike again with greater fury than before. He was a master of psychological warfare, manipulating the fear and confidence of his enemies, causing them to waver on the battlefield. As Harold's army advanced across the frozen fields, his victories were marked not only by physical destruction, but by the indelible mark they left on the cultures of the people he conquered. Prosperous cities were turned into deserts, churches burned, and entire villages were razed. But through it all, he built something even greater. He forged a dynasty, consolidating a Viking dynasty that, even in the face of so much destruction, gave the empire its own identity. An identity forged in the steel of war, the fury of battles, and the brutality of campaigns. And so Harold the Conqueror became the greatest Viking name of all time. With each land conquered, with each battle won, he left a trail of wreckage and a clear message. No man, no people, could challenge Harold's empire without paying the price of death. The army that followed him not only feared him, but worshipped him as a deity, for they understood that his leadership lay not only in strength, but in the ability to lead with vision, persuasion, and an almost supernatural power over the fate of his enemies. But what really drove them, what gave Harold absolute control over his horde, was the ever-expanding empire, the insatiable desire for more land, more wealth, more lives to conquer. And so, as the conqueror prepared for yet another foray, the northern breezes and icy waters of the North Sea were not just a setting for his campaigns. They were the hallmark of his immortality. What Harold and his army did not know, however, was that behind each victory, a new shadow would emerge, a threat even more fearsome than any enemy they had faced, one that would soon make them question just how far their strength could go. In the vastness of the frozen lands of the north, where the horizon disappears into snow-capped mountains and the winds cut like sharp blades, lies the small and forgotten village of Skarovik. In the distance, behind high walls of stone and wood, the Viking city of Kjeldstad, one of the greatest centers of power in the region, shines with its splendor of iron and fire. But while Kjeldstad shines in the light of wealth and grandeur, Skarovik remains humble, a small village struggling to survive in the shadow of its big sister. Even with its modest houses, mud streets, and inhospitable fields, the village carries a weight far greater than any treasure or material glory. It carries the indomitable spirit of a people who never bowed down and who, despite the hardships, kept the Viking traditions alive generation after generation. Skarovik is not just a village. It is a symbol of the resistance and resilience of the Viking people. Situated a few miles north of Kjeldstad, the village stands like a small bastion, often neglected by the powerful, but always on alert, knowing that in a world dominated by greater forces, any weakness could mean death. Its wooden houses, some simple huts and others more imposing, are built from the timbers of trees cut down in the surrounding forests, and the thatched roofs are resistant to the icy winds and sudden storms. Smoke from the chimneys rises into the gray sky, creating a landscape where the warmth of human life mixes with the deadly cold of the surrounding nature. In Skarovik, survival is not an option. It is a constant struggle, a collective effort to face adversity, where winter seems to be the only reliable friend. However, The village of Skarovik has a rich history, marked by heroic deeds and immortal battles, many of which began on long journeys across the northern seas and into the unknown lands beyond the icy fjords. It was founded by a small group of Vikings, descendants of great conquerors who settled in distant lands but who, over the years, chose the region to protect their families and continue their warrior traditions. The founding of the village was marked by a fierce battle against local clans, who resisted the presence of the Vikings, but were eventually overcome by the brute force and cunning of the Norse forces. There, in the valley between the mountains, the lands that Skarovik occupies were conquered by the sword and the unbreakable will of its founders. Over the years, the village prospered under the leadership of some of the most renowned warriors of its time. Legend has it that Skarovik's ancestors were direct descendants of some of the greatest Viking heroes, such as Ragnar Lothbrok, and that the village was always seen as a strategic point to defend the interests of the powerful Gjeldstad. Although the village never quite matched the grandeur of the town of Gjeldstad, with its imposing iron walls and thriving trade, it always held a position of respect among the Vikings of the region. What it lacked in size and wealth, it made up for in courage and fighting spirit. The current leader of the village, Bjorn Skarson, a man of great stature and presence, carries the weight of his name and lineage. Son of Haldir, the eternal warrior, who died on the shores of Ireland in an epic battle with the Saxons, Bjorn is a man who learned the value of strength and honor from an early age. Growing up under the watchful eye of a father who never lost a fight, Bjorn knew that his destiny was to protect Skarovik from any threat. Under his leadership, the village flourished in a time of relative peace, but always with a feeling that conflict was never truly far away. The young Vikings who lived in Skarovik were mostly descendants of ancient families who had become part of the village's history, and they were trained from an early age to become warriors. For them, the battlefield was as familiar as the hunting ground or the building of a house. This group of young Vikings who remained in Skarovik were men and women from different backgrounds, but united by a common mission: to protect the village and its traditions. Most of them were inexperienced in real combat, having been kept away from the great campaigns and trade voyages that took the more experienced warriors far away. However, these young men were not fools, and their Viking blood ran hot in their veins. There was Eric, a tall, muscular boy who dreamed of becoming a war leader like his grandfather. He had always been the most impetuous, defying the norm and seeking action, but his ways often brought him into conflict with the others. At his side was Ingrid, a woman with an indomitable spirit and skill with a bow and arrow, who always seemed calmer and more strategic, preferring caution and precision over brute force. They were not friends at first. On the contrary, they often found themselves at odds, vying for space and leadership within the small group. Then there was Arvid, the youngest of them all, a boy of just 15 who still saw himself as a mere apprentice, but with the potential to become a fearless warrior. He was quiet, observant, and his natural intelligence helped him quickly understand the dynamics of combat, even without the experience of the others. Beside him was Freya, a strong and fearless woman who had grown up as the daughter of a great warrior and knew the weight she carried in representing her lineage. Although she had never been sent to battle, Freya possessed a natural talent for fighting and a tenacity that made it difficult not to see her as a true leader. But despite their differences, these young Vikings were united by a common strength: the love of their land and the desire to honor the legacy of their ancestors. Although they often found themselves at odds, over time, the need to survive and protect what they loved most forged a bond between them, an unexpected sisterhood. They were forced to unite in the face of a threat they could not ignore. There was no more time for infighting or selfishness. They had a common goal: to save the village and ensure survival of the Viking people against a force they could barely understand, but knew was relentless. And it was in this climate of tension and forced unity that the group was given the mission to patrol the border and keep watch over the surroundings of Skarovik. Unbeknownst to them, they were about to become the last bastions of defense for a village that, in its humility, did not have the strength to face an army of invaders. While most of the experienced warriors sailed on missions of trade and alliances, the burden of survival fell on the shoulders of the young Vikings. And it was at this moment that the true story of Skarovik began to unfold, no longer as a simple village, but as a scene of potential war, where unknown heroes, forged in adversity, would emerge to challenge the impossible. Night fell early that day. The northern sky, as if foretelling the tragedy that was about to unfold, was covered with a thick layer of clouds. The icy wind whistled through the trees of the surrounding forest, and the village of Skarovik, with its small flames dancing in its chimneys, seemed to be nothing more than a small dark spot in the middle of an ocean of ice and shadows. The group of young Vikings had gone out on patrol, looking for any sign of suspicious movement in the surrounding area. But what they found was much more than they had expected. The sight before them was like a nightmare come true. As they approached their vantage point, from where they looked out over the open field in the distance, the smell of damp earth and snow mingled with something else. The sound of marching, heavy boots thumping against the ground, cut through the freezing air, and soon the horizon was filled with vision of indescribable terror. They were seeing for the first time the approaching army of Harold the Conqueror, a huge mass of armed men, in imposing ranks, marching silently like an army of the undead towards their village. Eric, Ingrid, Arvid, and Freya stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the enemy. Fear ran cold down their spines, their hearts pounding, pulsing in their temples like a distant war drum. Harold's army was not just a threat, but a wave of destruction that swept away everything in its path. The fear that gripped them was not the fear of a conventional fight, but the dread of helplessness, the despair in the face of an overwhelming force they could barely withstand. They were young, inexperienced, and far from the warriors who could challenge Harold and his men. But at the same time, something inside them flared up, a flame of courage, and indomitable would protect their home, their people, their legacy. And so, instead of retreating or hiding, they began to think, to plan, to fight with the only weapon they had left: cunning. Ingrid was the first to act. She knew that their only chance of survival would not come from an open battle, where they would be crushed without mercy. Something more was needed. Poison, she whispered to herself. Knowledge of poisons and plants that could be used in silent ambushes was not uncommon among the Vikings, especially for those who had been educated in darker practices, such as the pagan priests who knew the secrets of plants that could destroy or heal. Ingrid knew exactly what to do, so she gathered the group together and shared her idea. As Harold's soldiers slowly approached the camp, surrounding the area in a meticulous maneuver, the young Vikings knew that time was running out. They had to act quickly, or their entire world would be destroyed. The first task was to locate the poisonous plants, those that could be mixed into food and drink without the victim noticing until it was too late. The bitter cold of the forest seemed more intense at that moment, the sound of dry leaves underfoot amplified by the tension as they anxiously searched for these deadly herbs. Arvid, with his sharp eyes and practical mind, was the one who found the first plants. He crouched down in front of a small purple flower, which did not look like anything dangerous at first glance. But Ingrid, with her knowledge of botany, knew that it had the power to paralyze any human being, causing them to collapse slowly and agonizingly. She instructed Arvid to quickly gather as many of the plants as possible. Soon they found other varieties. Hemlock, a deadly herb in strychnine, whose seeds could be sprinkled into Harold and his men's drinks to cause a slow, painful death. While Freya, Ingrid, and Arvid gathered the plants, Eric took charge of organizing the preparation of the poison. With precision and silence, he crushed the herbs he had found, carefully mixing them in a small container that he would save for the right moment. The poison was a powerful mixture that would take several hours to take effect, but once in effect, its effects would be relentless. The idea was that before dawn, Harold's Vikings would already have the poison in their bodies, slowly suffering until it was too late to escape. The young Vikings felt the weight of their actions with every step they took. The air seemed heavier, and fear still haunted their minds, but they knew there was no turning back. The village of Skarovik depended on them. There were no other options. Even with their nerves on edge and the pressure on their every move, they executed their plan with precision. Poison was placed in the invaders' beer jugs and water supplies, a dose sufficient to ensure that the effect would be devastating. The poison would not kill immediately, but over the next few hours, it would begin to take effect, causing the enemy to feel indescribable pain, incapable of fighting or resisting. And so, in the dark dawn, as Harold's army prepared to rest, the poison began to do its silent work. At first, the men in Harold's army noticed nothing. But as the night wore on, the first signs began to appear. The most sensitive began to complain of stomach pains, dizziness, and a feeling of nausea that would not go away. Little by little, the poison spread through their bodies, causing a devastating effect, as effective as any sharp blade. Panic gripped Harold's ranks as the poison began to affect the first men. Those who had not been so severely hit began to retreat, feeling a strange sensation of weakness and helplessness. But it was already too late for most of them. Some fell to the ground, vomiting, losing consciousness, while others, unable to bear the increasing pain, fell without the strength to get up. Chaos quickly spread among Harold's men, who began to disorganize, the weakest falling while the strongest tried desperately to understand what was happening. And it was at that moment, when the tide of the battle seemed to be turning, that the young Vikings of Skarovik knew that they had saved their village. But the victory was not without cost. The sight of the chaos and destruction that befell Harold's men left a lasting impression on them. War was never fair, never without sacrifice. But when they saw Harold's survivors retreating, weakened by the poison, the young Vikings knew they had made the right choice. They had protected their home. With the enemy weakened and unable to advance, the Vikings of Skarovik sent messengers to Kjeldstad, warning the great city of the threat that still loomed. While Harold's survivors tried to regroup, it was the Viking city that struck the final blow, rallying its warriors to drive back the last of the enemy army. And so Skarovik was saved. Did you like this story? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next epic sagas. The journey continues.